Every version of the story ends with a body. A man is chosen. Maybe a captured prince, his royal blood a fresh wound to the people who lost him. Maybe the finest warrior in the queen's ranks, a man built for battle. They wash him. They perfume his skin. They walk him through corridors of packed earth and carved wood until he reaches the royal chamber. Inside, incense hangs in the air. Gold catches the light on the skin of the woman waiting for him. She sits like a god made flesh. For one night, he is given everything. Then the sky turns gray. A quiet figure steps through the door. The executioner. No fight, no shout. One motion, learned by repetition. And the man who was king until sunrise becomes another body carried out before the household wakes. That was the price. That was the tale of Queen Amina, who was said to take a new husband each night and bury him each morning to guard her throne and her secrets. But this was no story told to frighten children by the fire. Amina was real. A ruler in 16th century West Africa who cut an empire out of the land with iron and blood. She took more territory than any king before her. She raised walls of earth that still scar the ground in Nigeria today. Ramparts that ran for miles and swallowed whole cities behind them. 20,000 warriors marched at her word. They followed her because they had watched her make ruin look like craft. She was born into a world with fixed rules for women. Marry, bear heirs, obey. She looked at that world and its cages, and she chose to set the whole thing alight, then crown herself in the ash. This is not a story about a hero. It is a study of ambition taken to its limit. We will go through the records, the walls still standing in the dirt, and the legends that cling to her name. We will search for the truth of a woman who turned herself into a weapon. What does absolute power actually cost? How does a princess raised for the court become a tyrant feared across a continent? And what happens when the monster built to win your wars turns out to be you? Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. Take a second to subscribe and help us keep this project alive. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Zazzau ran on suffering, and it never slept. In the 16th century, this Hausa city was no home for poets. It was a machine. It crouched over the trans-Saharan trade routes the way a leopard waits at the edge of a spring. Caravans stretched for hundreds of camels, one line pushing up from the southern forests, another dragging down from the desert, both bending toward the high earthen walls of the city. Zazzau was one of the 7 true Hausa states: the Hausa Bakwai, Kano, Katsina, Gobir, Rano, Daura, Biram, and Zazzau itself. Each guarded its stretch of road. Each grew fat on what moved along it. The city that later took Amina's own name, Zaria, sat where the northern trade fed into the routes running down toward the forest kingdoms and the coast. Whoever held that junction held a knife against the throat of every merchant in the region. The caravans carried gold dust that glittered like trapped sun. They carried slabs of salt cut from the mines at Bilma and Tagaza, hauled across the Sahara on the backs of camels that died by the hundreds along the way. In the market, salt could be worth its weight in gold because a man without it died. They carried kola nuts from the south, the bitter stimulant that kept whole kingdoms awake and moving. They carried cloth dyed in the indigo pits of Kano, and leather so fine that when it reached Europe centuries later, traders called it Moroccan. And they carried people. Long ropes of men, women, and children, necks locked to wooden yokes, eyes emptied out weeks ago in a village that no longer stood. This was the coin of Zazzau. Everything had a price, and so did everyone. Nobody in this city ruled by the grace of the gods. You took power. You held it with your fists. You paid for it in other people's blood. This was the air Amina breathed from her first breath. She was born around 1533, granddaughter of the ruler Sarkin Nohir. Her grandmother, Bakwa Turunku, founded the walled seat that would grow into the great city. The name that follows Amina through the records, the daughter of Bakwa, ties her to that woman who built with earth and ambition. Power in this house ran through strong women. Amina simply took it further than any of them dared. But the palace was no refuge. It was the beating heart of the kingdom's cruelty. She did not fall asleep to songs. She fell asleep to the sounds carried up from below. Men breaking under torture in the cells. And above, traders arguing over the price of a human being in the courtyard. She was a princess. Her role was already written. She was a piece to be moved across the board of dynastic politics. She would learn court manners. She would learn how to host a visiting emir, how to weigh one marriage against another, which alliance to seal and which rival house to swallow whole through a wedding. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, was known for wealth, not war. Her reign is remembered as a time of peace and full granaries. She had 2 daughters. One learned to rule a household. The other went looking for the training yard. Amina watched her sister master the softer arts. She drifted through the palace like smoke, a mind full of quiet plots. Amina watched the other noble girls learn to weave, to run a household, to make themselves into prizes men would fight to own. And she saw exactly where the road led. A cage, a beautiful one, hung with gold, but a cage. She would be sold like a block of salt, traded for a stretch of land. Her body would become a factory for heirs. Her voice would vanish under some husbands. She looked at that future. Something hardened in her. She chose a different road. While the other girls sat in shaded rooms, Amina went to the training yard. The palace guards laughed the first time. A princess, barely grown, wanting to learn the spear. The laughing stopped fast. She took up a practice shaft and rammed the blunt end into the belly of a man twice her size. He folded, gasping in the dust. She was not playing. She was relentless. She spent her days under the flat sun, sweat cutting tracks through the dirt on her skin. Her hands should have been soft and scented. They cracked. They scarred. She learned the weight of a shield, the balance point of a blade, the exact instant to drive a horse from a trot into a full gallop that shook the ground. She learned the weapons of the Hausa cavalry, the long spear, the straight sword, quilted armor thick enough to turn an arrow, worn over horse and rider both. The same style of armor that survived in the northern courts for centuries after her. Chainmail traded up from the north, the stirrup and the saddle that let a rider strike downward with the full weight of a galloping horse behind the blow. She did not only learn to fight, she learned to kill. She studied the human body the way a butcher studies a carcass, hunting for the fastest way to end it. The court recoiled. To them, she was unmaking herself. She was spitting on the role the gods had handed her. She was turning into something with no name. Then her mother's line passed, and her younger brother took the throne. Karama. He ruled roughly a decade, from around 1566. He was clever, and unlike the rest of his court, he was not disgusted by his sister. He was fascinated. He looked at Amina and did not see a freak. He saw a weapon no enemy could plan for. Through those years, Amina rose through the ranks of the cavalry until she led it. The chronicles remember her as Magajia, the heir, the leading woman of the state. It was not an honorary title. She earned it on horseback, at the front, where the arrows came first. She stopped being a fighter and became a commander. She could read a battle the way a drummer reads a rhythm. She understood fear from the inside, how it moved through men, how it broke them. Her brother watched. He waited. When the moment came, he did not simply let her fight. He let her loose. The first time she rode out at the head of a Zazzau cavalry column, the enemy captains laughed too. They saw the small figure in front, ringed by scarred veterans, and took it for a boy prince sent to earn his first scar. Then the helmet came off. A woman. Her face still as carved stone, leading the charge. It broke something in them before a single blade fell. To them, it was the world turned upside down. That heartbeat of confusion was all her horsemen needed. They hit the enemy line like a bursting river, and Amina was always at the point of the spear. The Kano Chronicle, the record kept by the scribes of her rival city to the north, does not hide from her. It names her plainly. It says she waged war and conquered as far as Kwararafa and Nupe, that her power reached lands no ruler of Zazzau had touched before. It even claims the men of Nupa sent her 40 eunuchs and 10,000 kola nuts, that she was the first in the region to receive such tribute. When your enemies write down that you beat them and list what they paid you, the story stops being legend and becomes accounting. Her campaigns were not about honor. They were about erasure. She did not want to beat her enemies. She wanted to wipe them off the earth so completely that no one would raise a hand against Zazzau for a generation. Her name spread through the Hausa states, passed along the caravans, and traded in the markets. They called her a woman as capable as a man. It was not praise, it was a warning. She became a story rival kings told their own soldiers to keep them in line. They said no blade forged by man could cut her. They said she ate the hearts of the generals she killed. She let the stories run. Fear cut deeper than any sword. Her brother ran the state. Amina ran its violence. Together, they were one conquering machine in two bodies. The king and the weapon in his hand. But her power drew pressure the way a wound draws flies. She was reaching the age when a princess must marry. Suitors came from across the region, emirs and rich merchants, all wanting to bind themselves to the rising strength of Zazzau. They did not see a warrior. They saw a broodmare who happened to know how to sit a horse. They saw a step toward the throne. The court elders pushed her brother to force it. An unmarried princess of her years was a crack in the foundation. A scandal. So they set the choice in front of her. A wealthy prince from Kano, a power on the rise. Marry him, and the northern border stays quiet for 100 years. It was the sensible move. The whole court gathered to hear her answer. Understand what a marriage into Kano meant. Kano was the richest of the Hausa cities, walled since the 11th century, its market the largest in the region. A blood tie between Kano and Zazzau would have fused the two strongest states on the map. The elders were not asking for a wedding. They were asking her to hand the future to a man. The Kano prince stood before her, sure of himself. Amina looked at him. She looked at her brother on the throne. She looked at the ring of nobles, their faces caught between hope and dread. In a voice that carried to the walls, she refused. Then she went further. She swore an oath. She would never marry. She would never bear a child. Her body would carry no man's bloodline. She was wedded to her army, her only heir, would be the empire she meant to build. The silence after that felt like the floor dropping out of the world. This was not politics. This was a woman cutting herself loose from the future. To reject marriage and children was to sever the cord of ancestry that held her people together. In a society where a ruler's legitimacy leaned on lineage, on descent traced back through named ancestors, she was announcing that her line ended with her. She was choosing to be a storm that rages and passes and leaves no name behind, a ghost in her own story. And this is where the darkest legends were truly born. The people could not understand it. A woman who wanted no husband and no child? Impossible. Unnatural. So they built a story to cover the whole. A hunger so vast it could only be fed one night at a time before it turned lethal. They whispered that she still took lovers, a new man every night, taken from among the warriors of whatever town she had just crushed. But since no one could ever own her, since no man could ever be allowed to claim a piece of her, he had to be gone by first light. Some versions say he was killed. Some say he was simply cast out at dawn, forbidden ever to speak her name. The nightly killings were never a fact. They were an excuse, a patriarchal world inventing a monster because it could not accept a woman who had thrown out its oldest law, that a woman exists to belong to a man. The day she swore that oath, she stopped being a woman in their eyes. She became a force, a god, or a demon. The bond between Amina and her brother was the ground Zazzau stood on. He was the mind. She was the blade. But it was a partnership sitting on a crack. He had unleashed something he could not fully steer. He needed her. He also feared her. Her loyalty was not to him. It was to the army she had bled beside for over a decade. Those men did not fight for the Sarki in his palace. They fought for the woman who rode at their front, who ate from the same pot, who knew their names, who dragged them through victories that should not have been possible. Her true seat of power was not the palace with its scheming nobles and their quiet knives. It was the war camps, among the fighters who owed her their lives and their loot. That was the truth hanging over the whole reign. He wore the crown. She held the kingdom's violence in her fist. Picture the war camp at dusk. Cooking fires in a wide ring across the dry ground. Horses picketed in lines, stamping and blowing. The smell of millet porridge and horse sweat and oiled leather. Men mending harness by firelight, sharpening blades on wet stone. The long scrape of iron over rock repeating down the whole camp like a chant. Somewhere a griot works a small drum, singing the names of towns already fallen, weaving today's dead into tomorrow's legend. And in the middle of it, the commander who slept on the same hard earth they did. That was where her real throne stood. Not in Zaria, here in the dirt, among the men who had killed for her. She was building something with those campaigns beyond loot. She was opening roads. The Hausa states owed their wealth to trade, and trade needed protection. Where her army passed, the routes fell under Zazzau's control, and the tolls flowed back to her. She was not just a raider. She was pulling the whole map of West African commerce toward her city. One conquered crossroads at a time, and she began to change the land itself. The chronicles credit her with the earthen ramparts that ring the towns she took, walls raised to hold what her spear had won. The people came to call them Ganua Amina, Amina's walls. She was learning that a conqueror who takes a place and rides on will lose it. A conqueror who walls it keeps it. That lesson would define everything she built after. We tell these stories for a reason beyond the telling. We are building a place for people who already sense that history is darker and stranger than any classroom admitted. If you feel that pull, if you understand what we are doing here, join the lineage. It is the membership of this channel, our inner circle. Join, and you stop being only a viewer. You become a patron of the work. You keep the research going. You keep these journeys into the dark alive and made with the care they deserve. You get our gratitude and access to perks we save for our own. If you believe in this, if you are one of us, step into the ranks. The link is in the description. Then, after roughly a decade on the throne, her brother fell ill. A fever tore through him in days. One morning, he held court. A week later, they were washing his body for burial. In a land without written medicine and without any settled law of succession, a king's death was not a passing of the crown. It was an open door, and everyone with a claim came running for it. His death opened a hole in the center of power, and the whole kingdom leaned toward the edge of it. The court elders met in secret. In Hausa politics, the great men around the throne held real weight. The title holders, the war captains, the keeper of the treasury, the keeper of the granaries, the master of the horse. Together, they could make a king or unmake one. They had watched dynasties turn on a single quiet meeting like this one. They knew Amina was the strongest force in the land. But a woman on the throne, a woman who had spat on marriage and tradition, was unthinkable to them. So they whispered names: distant male cousins, soft nobles who could be propped up and pulled by strings. They thought they had time. They thought the old traditions would shield them. They were wrong. The news of the king's death moved fast, carried by riders down the trade roads that Zazzau had spent generations mastering. It reached Amina in her war camp on the southern border. She did not weep. She did not wait for a summons to the capital. She gave one order: march on Zaria, now. Her column of veterans covered the ground at a speed the plotters could not have pictured. Cavalry moving light, changing horses, riding through the heat of the day when sane men rested. They reached the city gates and did not knock. The gates swung open. The city guards were soldiers, and their loyalty had never belonged to the palace. She led her deadliest men straight to the royal doors. Imagine the sound of it inside the walls. The rumble of hooves on packed earth, growing. The shouts on the walls turning from alarm to something else when the men up there saw whose banner rode at the front. Then the gates, groaning open on their own side's decision. Merchants in the market froze. Mothers pulled children indoors. The whole city understood in an instant that the question of who ruled had already been answered, out on the road, before a word was spoken in the throne room. The elders were still inside the throne room, heads bent together over their conspiracy, when the great wooden doors split apart. Amina stood in the opening. No mourning robes. She wore the same dust-caked leather and iron shin guards she wore into battle. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword. Behind her stood the silent, sun-scorched faces of the men who had won her an empire. She looked at the old men who thought they could shut her out. She said nothing. She did not need to. The weapon her brother had forged was now aimed at the heart of the kingdom, and her fingers were already tightening. There was no crown lowered onto her head, no priests, no sacred oil, no chanting crowd. There was the throne room, the smell of fear soaked into the walls, and 500 killers standing behind a woman in armor still marked from the road. The elders who had plotted against her dropped to their knees. A few wept. Others just stared, unable to fit what had happened into the shape of the world they knew that morning. Amina crossed the floor, her iron soles scraping stone. She did not glance at them. To her, they were already dead men still breathing. She climbed the dais. She turned. She sat on the throne of her brother and her father before him. It was too big for her. She did not lean back. She sat forward on the edge, coiled, like something waiting for the moment to strike. Then she did nothing. For 3 months, she held court. She heard petitions. She sealed edicts. She let the market open as it always had. Camels kneeling in the dust, while agents weighed salt on hanging scales. The kingdom began to breathe. The nobles started to whisper that maybe they had misjudged her. Maybe she would keep the seat warm and rule with a careful hand. Maybe the storm had passed them by. They were fools. That silence was not peace. It was a chest filling with air before a scream. In the 4th month, she gave the order. The army had rested and rearmed. Now it would march. Not south to guard the border, not north to talk with Kano. West, into a tributary chiefdom that had been slow with its payments since her brother died. It was a small insult. A stern letter would have fixed it. Amina fixed it with fire. She did not send a general. She rode at the front herself. Her army came down on the towns without warning and without terms. 2 choices only: bend or be erased. The regional capital tried to hold. They barred the gates and lined the walls. Amina's men threw up siege towers in a single day, lashing green wood into frames tall enough to reach the parapet. By nightfall, her soldiers were on the ramparts, and the killing had started in the streets below. Thatch caught. The night went orange. You could hear the roof beams cracking one house after another, and under that, the thinner sound of people running. She ordered the chief taken alive. They dragged him before her in chains, a proud man reduced to shaking. She did not kill him. She had him lashed to a post in the middle of his own burning city and left there. The message went out across the Hausa lands, and it landed. The time for politics was finished. Tribute or fire. Those were the terms now. This became the shape of her reign. Conquest was not a single event. It was a method. And once a city fell, it never rose free again. Her genius showed after the fighting stopped. So did the horror of her. She built. Across every stretch of ground she took, she drove the conquered into a new bondage. Their labor would raise the monuments to their own defeat. The Ganua Amina, Amina's walls. These were not carved stone. They were earthworks, vast and plain and crushing. Thousands of laborers, men and women, worked from first light to dark. They swung iron hoes at the hard red soil. They mixed it with gravel and water, packed it into baskets, and carried it on their heads, load after load, until the tally ran into tens of thousands of tons. They raised the walls in layers, pounding each course until it set like rock. In the wet season, the earth held its shape. In the dry, the surface baked to a shell. The technique was old in this land. Long before Amina, the Hausa built with tubali, mud bricks shaped by hand and dried in the sun, and the great mounds at Kano had been rising and thickening since the 11th century. Amina took a known method and drove it to a scale no ruler had attempted. The ramparts climbed out of the plains, some 40 or 50 feet tall, running for miles, cut with narrow gateways and studded with towers. The tops were broad enough for soldiers to march along in column. Every city she took, she wrapped in one of these earthen cages. The walls were not really about defense. They were about control. A city ringed by an Amina wall could be sealed in an hour. Nothing in, nothing out, without her garrison's word. A revolt could be starved flat without a single spear thrown. And every day, the people inside looked up at a mountain of earth their own hands had raised, and understood exactly who owned them. She was carving her name into the land. This place is mine. It stays mine. You live here because I permit it. Children were born and buried within sight of those walls. The walls outlived her. They outlived her empire and the memory of the kingdoms she swallowed. The old Kano ramparts she inspired grew to reach 11 miles around, with more than a dozen gates that closed at dusk and opened at dawn, a rhythm the city kept for centuries. Travelers arriving after nightfall slept outside in the dark, waiting for the horn that opened the wall. Her own works stand today, worn low by wind and rain, but there, the last quiet witness to how far her ambition reached, and what it cost the people who built it. Amina knew war was only one blade of the shears. Wealth was the other. She did not just take cities. She took the region by the throat, and the throat was trade. Before her, the caravans chose their own roads, weighing tolls and safety, and which market paid best, playing Kano against Katsina. Amina cut through all of it. She took every town, every waterhole, every river crossing along the great corridors, one after another. Her cavalry became the new fact of the road. Any camel train carrying salt from the desert or gold from the south that did not ride under the banner of Zazzau was prey. She did not bargain over tolls. She took tribute, a share of every cargo, handed to her agents posted along the routes. Refuse, and the caravan vanished into the bush. The goods seized. The merchants and their guards sold in the same slave markets they had set out to supply. The wealth of West Africa changed course. Gold, salt, human lives, all of it bent toward one city, Zaria. The Kano Chronicle remembers the tribute that came to her from Nupe, 40 eunuchs and 10,000 kola nuts, and says she was the first ruler in the land to be paid that way. It marks her as the one who forced the whole region to acknowledge Zazzau. The markets of Kano and Katsina shrank. Their treasuries thinned. She was not only beating her rivals in the field, she was draining them, one caravan at a time, and pouring what she drained into a larger and better armed force. She built her golden age on the wreck of her neighbors' economies. She also changed what her soldiers rode into battle. The chronicles credit her time with the spread of metal armor in the region. Iron helmets and mail brought up the desert roads she now controlled. A rider in mail on a horse in quilted padding could break a line of men who owned nothing but spears and hide shields. She had turned trade wealth into iron, and iron into more conquest. The circle fed itself. Her court grew with the spoils. The 40 eunuchs from Nupa served her chambers and carried her orders, men who could hold no ambition of their own, and so could never plot a throne for themselves. Her stables filled with horses from the north, the most valuable thing a Hausa lord could own, each animal worth a village. Her granaries in Zaria stood full while the cities she had bled went hungry. She had built a state that took in everything and gave back only fear. She rewrote the roads themselves. The kola nut, once a luxury traded in small handfuls, now moved north in bulk because she controlled the paths it traveled. The taste for it spread through the Hausa courts and beyond. A small habit she seeded across a whole region while she was busy conquering it. Everything her armies touched, she monetized. Even the men she captured became coin, funneled into the markets that made Zazzau rich. For years the other Hausa states watched and did nothing, held still by fear and by their own hatred of each other. Kano's true enemy was Katsina, and Katsina's was Kano. Their feud went back generations, fought over the same trade and the same pride. They plotted against one another while the real threat grew fat on their southern edge. But Amina would not stop. Her borders pushed out. Her demands grew heavier. At last, the surviving kings saw it plainly, eaten one by one, or standing together. This was no alliance for glory. It was a pact to survive. The two old enemies, Kano and Katsina, did the unthinkable. They made peace. Old men who had spent their lives cursing each other's houses now sat under the same roof and swore to a common cause. They pledged their armies to a single purpose: end the Queen of Zazzau. Smaller states joined, each carrying its own wound from her, each afraid of being the next wrapped in her earthen prison. They gathered the largest army the region had ever assembled, the coalition. Their plan was blunt: march on Zaria, burn it, and kill the woman on the throne. The coalition came south, sure of its numbers. They expected a great open battle, warriors against warriors, a day the griots would sing about for 100 years. They got nothing of the kind. Amina had no use for glory, only for winning. She refused to meet them in the field. She turned her own kingdom into a trap. As the coalition advanced, they found emptiness, villages abandoned, cooking fires cold, mats left rolled in the corners of houses where people had lived a week before, granaries burned to ash, wells filled with sand or with the swollen carcasses of animals so no man would drink, scorched earth taken to a completeness they had never seen. The huge army, with its thousands of men and pack animals, began to starve. In the dry heat, the water ran out first. The animals dropped, then the weakest men. Morale rotted. They were swinging at a ghost, and she made the ghost cruel. She used her ring of walled towns to draw them into siege after pointless siege. The coalition commanders, desperate for a win, would spot a fortified city and believe they had finally trapped part of her force. They would sit down before the walls, spend weeks and thousands of lives clawing at the earthworks under archers who never seemed to run short of arrows. When they finally broke in, the town was empty. A ghost garrison. Just enough men left behind to fight for show, then slip out a hidden gate in the dark. The coalition bled itself white, taking empty prizes. Amina's real army stayed whole, shadowing them, waiting. Months of it. The invaders shrank under hunger, disease, and the slow madness of hunting an enemy that would not appear. Camp sickness spread through the tents. Men who had marched south as conquerors now argued over a handful of grain. The commanders of Kano and Katsina, so recently reconciled, began to blame each other again in the dark. The old feud crept back in through the cracks that hunger opened, a dying giant, staggering through a wasteland it had helped make, and quarreling with itself as it fell. At last, worn to nothing, the coalition reached the plains before Zaria. They looked up at the walls of the capital, the greatest of all the Ganua Amina, and the strength went out of them. No siege left in their legs. They pitched a broken camp and planned one last suicidal rush. They did not know this was the exact spot she wanted them. This was no defense. It was an ambush, laid and baited over months. She had worn them down for a reason. Now she would finish it. Her own men were fresh, fed, and hidden inside the walls, standing to their horses in the dark, hands over the muzzles to keep them quiet. On a moonless night, the gates of Zaria slid open. No war cry, no warning. Just 20,000 soldiers moving through the dark, hooves wrapped, spears low. They came down on the sleeping camp. It was not a battle. It was slaughter. The starved, exhausted men of Kano and Katsina died in their tents. Some woke only to feel a blade go in, Before they understood, the night had turned on them. The chaos ran the whole length of the camp before any horn could sound. Men stumbled into their own comrades in the dark and struck them down by mistake. The retreat, when it broke, was a scramble to survive, men running without weapons, without direction, some throwing off their armor to run faster. Her cavalry chased the fugitives for miles, riding them down across the plain until dawn showed what was left. The Great Coalition did not merely lose. It was taken apart, killed off, and wiped from the map. The records of this time, from the Kano Chronicle to the oral histories carried down by the Hausa griots, all describe a ruler with no equal. Her command of war, her cold hand on the economy, the scale of what she took. Some later writers tried to place her a century earlier, in the 1400s, and the exact dates still cause arguments among historians. But every source agrees on the shape of her, a woman who bent the region to her will and left her walls behind as proof. Centuries later, when the modern nation took form, it would put her face on its money and raise her statue in the capital. The conqueror turned into a symbol of the strength she once used against her neighbors. The griots kept her name alive long before any of that, singing her as the woman as capable as a man, the phrase repeated at courts across the Hausa country for generations. The book that shaped much of what you are hearing today is a work of dark and careful research, an archive of the terror and strategy that ran through her reign. If you want to feel the full weight of this story, that source belongs on your shelf. You can find it right now through the View Products button on your screen. It is the centerpiece of this investigation. While you are there, look across the rest of the shelf. We have gathered other pieces tied to this era, relics and immersive finds chosen to pull you deeper into it. Open the shop. See what is waiting. Keep walking this road with us. After the massacre, the kings of Kano and Katsina had nothing left but to beg for peace. Amina received their envoys not in her throne room, but in her war tent. Her army still gathered around her, the smell of horses and smoke still on everything. The envoys came on foot, stripped of their weapons, and knelt on the ground where she could look down at them. What she offered was not a treaty. It was a deed of ownership. She asked for no land. She already held everything she wanted. Instead, she set a yearly tribute so heavy it was simply the price of being allowed to live. They would pay her to exist. Thousands of kola nuts, eunuchs for her court, gold by the sackload. And they would speak aloud the supremacy of Zazzau, the old rivals bowing their heads before a woman. She had not just beaten her rivals. She had broken them. She had crushed their pride and made them her vassals. Now she stood alone. From the banks of the Niger in the south to the sand's edge in the north, no power could touch her. Master of her whole world. Her rule reached across a stretch of land no Zazzau ruler had held before or would hold again. A wide belt of the Hausa country answering to one throne. A queen forged in blood, ruling an empire built on walls and fear. She had won. She had every single thing she had ever reached for. She was the most powerful person for 1,000 miles in any direction. And in the quiet, after the last battle, sitting on a throne too large for her, she began to notice something she had no weapon for. The chair beside her had always been empty. Now the whole room was. The men who once plotted against her were gone, and with them the only voices that had ever pushed back. Her brother was 30 years in the ground. Her mother, longer. There was no one left to answer to, and no one left to defeat. And a weapon with nothing left to cut turns, in the end, on the hand that holds it. The win over the coalition left a silence that spread across the Hausa states, the silence of a burial ground after the digging stops. Zaria became the heart of that quiet world. It swelled with a wealth that bordered on obscene. Tribute from Kano and Katsina poured in, gold and silver filling the vaults until they strained. Caravans now flew her banner because they had no other choice. They carried silk from far countries, spices that hung sweet and heavy over the market stalls, war horses from the north with coats like polished stone. The city was a monument to her triumph. A cold one. Palaces went up. The mosques grew. Islam had reached the Hausa courts through the trade routes generations before her, and the merchants who filled her market prayed toward Mecca while they weighed her tribute. Her city drew scholars, dyers, leather workers, men who lowered cloth into indigo pits and turned raw hides into the tanned goods that would one day carry the name of this region all the way to European ports. But the streets ran under a watchful hush. It was a gilded cage, and at its center, on a seat of ivory and plundered gold, sat the one it caged. Amina was never alone, and always alone. Thousands of people moved around her. Slaves crossed the palace with their eyes on the floor, afraid to make a sound. Eunuchs kept the household accounts, faces blank as masks. The 40 who had come as tribute from Nupe now ran her private rooms, men cut off from any line of their own, chosen because they could never scheme toward a throne. Her old commanders, men who had ridden beside her for decades, now stood in her hall in fine cloth, scarred hands resting on jeweled hilts. They were richer than they had ever dreamed. They were also afraid of her. She had no equals, no one to confide in, no friends. The sister who once understood the games of the court was long dead. Her brother, the only person who had ever looked at her and seen something more than a monster or a tool, had been gone 30 years. The people she grew up beside were either buried or too frightened to speak to her as anything but a living god. She ate alone. She walked the palace gardens alone. The laughter and gossip that fill a rich king's court simply were not there. Only the whisper of flatterers and the quiet weight of the executioner standing somewhere behind a curtain. She had the absolute power she had traded her whole humanity to reach. Now that it was in her hands, she found it hollow. A throne is the loneliest ground on earth. She had taken every city and beaten every army and built herself a world with room for only one. The hush in her court had a twin, deeper and further off, the silence of her own future. The oath she swore as a young woman, the refusal of marriage and children, had been the foundation of everything. It had made her a creature of pure will, cut loose from the ties and soft spots that bind ordinary people. It had let her become a weapon. Now, in the still years after victory, that oath turned its other face toward her. Not strength, a curse. She had built the largest empire the Hausa had ever known. A sprawl of land held together by fear and her own presence. But who was it for? An empire is a thing you pass down. It is raised for sons and grandsons. In this land, succession ran through the great houses, through named descent, through the mothers who bore future kings. Amina had shut that door herself. She had no son. She had no heir. She had built a great machine of power designed to seize up the moment her heart stopped. That was the horror gnawing at her reign. Every wall she raised, every city she took, every sack of gold added to the pile was a monument built on sand, waiting for the tide of her own death. Her commanders saw it. The vassal kings paying her tribute saw it. They all understood that the power was not Zazzau. The power was Amina, and Amina would not live forever. The question of who came next was not some far-off matter of policy. It was a ghost pacing the palace corridors every night. The empire hung suspended, kept alive by one aging woman's breath. The instant that breath failed, everything she had killed for would be torn apart by the very wolves she had trained to hunt. Her life's work was a performance, brilliant, bloody, and, in the end, temporary. Picture the throne room in the low light of evening. The tribute stacked along the walls, sacks of cola nuts split at the seams, bolts of cloth she would never wear, gold she would never spend, lamplight moving over the packed earth floor, a single old woman at the center of it, listening to a court that told her only what she wanted to hear. Beyond the walls, her city hummed with the trade she had captured, and none of it could give her the one thing an empire is built to make: a future. Consider the other rulers of her age, if only to measure her loneliness. In Kano and Katsina, the kings sat surrounded by sons, brothers, wives, cousins, a whole web of blood ready to carry the name forward. Their courts argued over who would inherit, and that argument was a sign of life. Amina's court had no such argument, because there was nothing to inherit that could survive her. A king with heirs plans in decades. Amina could plan only to the length of her own body. Everything past that was a cliff. The years began to collect their debt. The weapons started to rust. Decades in the saddle, decades sleeping on hard ground, had marked her body. Old wounds ached when the rains came. Her sword arm, once tireless, burned after an hour of practice. She still called for a horse each morning out of habit, and mounting it now took 2 men to steady the animal. Her reflection in polished bronze showed a stranger. A face like worked leather, lined and hard. Eyes that had once held a cold fire, now clouded with tiredness that no sleep touched. And as the body wore down, the mind followed. Paranoia, the tyrant's constant shadow, moved in. She read plots in every corner. 2 guards speaking low became a conspiracy. A commander late to a meeting was planning a coup. She trusted no one, and how could she? She had taught them all that loyalty was a thing to be bought and power the only true God. She had built a court of ruthless, ambitious men, and now she was locked inside it with them. An aging lioness ringed by younger predators, all of them watching for the first stumble. Her generals had grown into lords of their own. Each held a walled town, a garrison, a share of the tribute roads. Each had ridden long enough to believe he could rule as well as serve. They bowed low while she lived. They counted her years while they bowed. Every one of them knew that on the day she died, the man with the strongest garrison and the fastest riders would take the most. She had made them capable of exactly that. She had trained her own successors to fight over her corpse. There is a bitter symmetry in it. As a young woman, she had ridden into a throne room to crush the old men who thought they could deny her. Now she was the old ruler, and a new generation of hard men stood around her chair the way she had once stood around a corpse, waiting for the seat to empty. She had shown them how it was done. They had learned. Did she still hear the screams? In the dead of night, when the palace went silent, did the ghosts of the men she was said to have taken and killed at dawn come back to her? The legend she had let stand, the one that thickened her mystique, did it now circle her in her solitude? We cannot know, but a life laid over that much violence leaves marks on whatever is left inside. She had made herself a fortress, sealed off from every human tie. And the enemy was not outside the wall. It was in the room with her. The monster she had built to win her wars was the last companion she had. She had traded everything for power, and power was all that stayed. A cold thing to grow old beside. So she did the only thing she still knew how to do. She went to war. Zazzau was safe. The tributary states obeyed. The trade roads were hers. There was no reason to march. Her advisors, the few brave enough to open their mouths, begged her to stay. The army needed rest. The treasury was full. She had earned the right to rule from her capital in peace. They did not understand. Peace was a foreign country to her. The throne room, with its silk and its whispers, was the prison. The only ground where she had ever felt awake, ever felt like herself, was the back of a horse, a blade in her hand, the dust of the trail in her throat. War was no longer a tool. It was a hunger. A predator hunts or stops being a predator. This was a slow act of self-destruction dressed as a campaign, a last ride back into the only self she had ever owned. She announced a new war. South into the wet, tangled country of the Nupe, a river people along the Niger who had long refused Zazzau's grip. It was a foolish war. No clear aim, bad ground. A march toward death. And she rode at its head, an old woman looking for the one kind of end she could respect. It went wrong from the start. The Nupe were nothing like the city dwellers of the open plains. They were people of the water, masters of the ambush in the swamps and forests of the Niger Valley. They moved by canoe through channels her scouts could not read. They knew which paths held a man's weight and which swallowed him. Amina's heavy cavalry, unstoppable on flat ground, was useless in the wetlands. Horses sank to the belly in black mud. Riders bogged down and were speared where they stuck. Her soldiers were picked off by archers they never saw. Fever bred in the standing water and moved through the ranks. In the heat, the dead could not be buried fast enough, and the smell of the camp turned men's stomachs before any fight began. The commander who once read a battle like a song seemed to have lost the tune. Her orders came erratic, reckless. She drove the army deeper into a land that was swallowing it, hunting the great final battle. The Nupe would not give it to her. They struck at dusk and vanished into the reeds. They bled her instead, 1,000 small cuts, day after day. The veterans who had followed her for 30 years began to fall in a country that meant nothing, for a war with no name to it. The same tactics she had once used against the coalition, the ambush, the refusal to stand, the slow bleeding of a larger force, were now being used against her. The Nupe were teaching her her own lesson in the mud. Her end came not in Zaria, not on her throne, but in a small town called Atagara, deep in the enemy country she never conquered. The sources fall silent on how she died. No last epic clash, no blaze of glory. The great Queen Amina, taker of cities, terror of the Hausa states, simply stopped. Was it a poisoned dart from the cover of a mangrove? A fever that finally burned through her old body, leaving her helpless in her tent while flies gathered at the door? Or something the old whispers preferred? They said that in Atagara she took a last lover, a local chief, or a captured Nupe prince, and that in the morning no executioner came. Instead, the man, having learned her secret, drove a blade into her heart while she slept, settling the debt of every man said to have come before him. We will never know. The conqueror who had lived her life as public myth died quietly, far from home, with no one to record the hour. The queen who had walled whole cities to prove she owned them ended in a place too small to leave a mark on any map she kept. No tomb was raised over her that we can find. No monument. The woman who spent her life making the land remember her name left no grave the land could point to. Her empire died with her. The news raced back to Zaria along the same trade roads she had spent her life seizing. The fragile bindings of fear that held her lands together snapped the moment the word arrived. It happened exactly as she must have known it would. The tributary states declared themselves free before her body was cold. Kano and Katsina threw off Zazzau's dominance and picked up their old feud where they had dropped it. The peace between them dying with the woman who had forced it on them. Her own generals, men she had raised out of nothing, turned on one another. Each rode for the capital with his garrison at his back. They carved the kingdom apart in a war of their own, and the walls she had built to cage her enemies now sheltered the rivals fighting over her bones. The tribute stopped moving. The agents she had posted along the roads scattered or were killed. The river of gold and salt and captives that she had bent toward Zaria straightened out again and returned to its old beds, flowing to Kano, to Katsina, to whoever could now hold a stretch of road. Within a few seasons it was as if the great redirection had never happened. The market of Zaria, once the richest in the region, thinned back to what it had been before she rose. The 40 eunuchs of Nupe, the horses, the vaults of gold, all of it was seized, scattered, or spent by men who had no memory of what it had cost to gather. Within a single generation, the great empire of Zazzau was a memory. Everything she fought for, bled for, and traded her soul to build turned to dust. Out of a reign that ran some 34 years, 2 things survived her. The first was the terror of her name, a legend told to frighten children for the next 500 years. The griots kept singing her long after her state was gone. The woman as capable as a man, the phrase repeated at courts that had forgotten every king who came after. The story of the lovers killed at dawn grew louder with each retelling, until the myth was larger than the queen, and most who spoke her name knew the legend better than a single true fact of her reign. The second was the walls. The vast, silent earthworks that still run across the ground in Nigeria today. Grass grows over them now. Herders drive cattle along the tops where her soldiers once marched. Rain has rounded off the sharp edges her laborers pounded flat. They are her only true legacy, the hollow, crumbling ruins of an empire raised by a woman who conquered the world and died owning nothing but her own myth. Centuries on, the nation that grew over her bones would put her face on its money and stand her statue in its capital, turning the tyrant into a hero, the conqueror into pride, remembering the strength and quietly forgetting the cost. School children would learn her name as a founder. Almost none would learn about the men driven into the sun to raise the very walls now praised as her monument. Long after her, a woman named Nana Asma'u, daughter of a great scholar in this same land, would win fame with a pen instead of a spear, teaching and writing where Amina had only burned. 2 ways for a woman to be remembered by this country. Amina chose the sword, and the sword remembered her the only way it knew how. She had wanted to be remembered. She got her wish. She was remembered as a warning and a wonder, both at once, and never as a woman anyone had known. That was the last cost of the bargain she made as a girl in a training yard, the one that traded every soft thing a life can hold for a name that would outlast the land itself. She paid it in full, and she died alone in a swamp, far from the throne, with no heir to weep and no grave to mark the spot. Thank you for staying to the very end of this journey. If you believe stories like this one deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel, tap like on this video, and send it to one person who needs to see it. Tell us in the comments what you make of her, the hero, the tyrant, or both at once. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. Another story is already waiting. Another descent into the dark. Click the video appearing on your screen now and keep walking the road with us. Watch it now.